Now, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Dane McCongan, lawyer of energy in the office of Holland and Knight in Austin, Texas. At present, he works as president of the Public Utility Law of the Texan School of Law. He has a vast experience in representing clients before state regulator. He's certified in administrative law by the School of Law of the state of Texas. He has also worked as a main lawyer in more than 40 companies of the natural gas sector, and he represents those vertically integrated electricity companies in the cost of the service fee and fuel. He acts as a lawyer for many clients in state and federal courts. Dr. McCongan will speak about regulation, the incorporation of low emission energy sources and its impact and reliability, specifically as of the study of the case of Texas, where they suffered an energy crisis early this year. Which were the causes of the crisis and the lessons? So I would like to give the floor to Dr. McCon. Permítame hacerle una pregunta. ¿Cómo fue posible que Texas, si
had this breakdown? How was it possible? How do you explain that? Welcome.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here, Claudia. I appreciate the introduction. We're going to talk about that. There's actually more than one reason, and there are efforts underway to try and diagnose the problems and fix them. I'm not quite sure we are there yet, but we are certainly hoping to get there sooner rather than later. I myself was out of power for 5 days, so I felt the pain as well as thousands of and millions of other people across the state. So that's what I'm here to talk about, is kind of the lessons learned from this event. And I think part of that also requires looking into what caused it. So apologize if that's a very long-winded answer to your question, but I'm afraid it's not as simple as we would like it to be. But again, I appreciate the time you give me today, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. And so if we can move on to the next slide. Oh, I'm running my own slides. Apologize. Okay, so let's talk about the storm in general. Winter Storm Uri, U-R-I, is what they have been calling it. But to back up a little bit, to tell you what a winter in Austin or in Texas in general is normally like in February. Usually the temperatures are somewhere between 45 degrees and 65 degrees Fahrenheit. We rarely ever get snow anytime in the winter. When my children see flurries and snow, they get very, very excited. And so February is usually when people start going outside and sitting by their pool and trying to catch some sun in those days where we are the sunniest part of the United States. But of course, that did not happen this time. So it started getting really, really cold on Saturday, February the 13th. On Sunday, February the 14th, we started getting lots of precipitation, which froze over and froze the roads. And then from February the 14th through the 17th or 18th, the entire state, all 254 counties of Texas, was under freezing weather, under ice and snow. A disaster was declared by the governor for all 254 of those counties. And that's a very large area, as you would imagine, covering an awful lot of different types of terrain. It's the coldest weather in Dallas in 72 years. I mentioned Austin, where I live. My children were excited to see flurries. We had 8 inches of snow, and it stayed on the ground for 5 days. So we liked it the first day, but got very tired of it very soon thereafter. And most importantly, almost 150 people died. I've seen some estimates that it was closer to 700. And that's a terrible way to go. And that's people will never get back again. And so that is clearly the most tragic part about this. But to look more specifically at ERCOT, and the impact it had on the energy delivery system, both electricity and gas. I want to dig in a little bit more on that. And just as a background on ERCOT is a single ISO within the state of Texas. It is not connected in any meaningful way to the grids across the rest of the United States. There's the Eastern United States grid and there's the Western United States grid. So everyone there is interconnected. And then there's Texas. And so ERCOT is solely within Texas, covers about 90% of all of the load in the state. There are portions of the state which are not ERCOT, like towards El Paso or in Northeast Texas, you'll see that. But the great preponderance of residents, businesses, and everything else is within the ERCOT area. ERCOT is an energy-only market. I'll get into the distinction between an energy-only market and a capacity market in a little bit. But suffice it to say that within ERCOT, with the exception of some municipally owned systems or co-ops, people can choose who their electric provider are. The utility is simply the wires at that point in time. It is, it's the folks who take the electrons and transmit it over distance or distribute it to your house. And then you interface with what's called a rep, a retail electric provider, to sign a contract for what you're going to charge for your power. And those contracts can be very different from, a fixed rate or something that is indexed to the wholesale market price of energy. And we'll get into that in a little bit as well. So that's kind of an overall view of what the ERCOT market is. So from there, I think we can now talk about how it was affected. And first of all, the storm affected all generation technologies. There were some initial stories out there blaming it on wind or blaming it on renewables, but the temperature and the ice and the snow did not discriminate against any particular source of generation. In ERCOT, about 50% of all generation is natural gas. Thermal units burning natural gas. About 25% is wind, so we do have a lot of wind. And then the remaining 25% is a mixture of nuclear, of solar, of coal, and some hydro. But by far the largest contributor is gas, and second largest is wind. And all of the units, nuclear included, everything included, suffered from the cold because we're just not built or we didn't anticipate that level of sustained cold and precipitation. So going back a little bit, I mentioned that on February the 14th is when the ice really started. That evening, that night, we reached a winter peak for ERCOT ever of almost 70,000 megawatts of demand in winter. That's a very hot summer day. So that is not the time winter is not the time that you would anticipate that level of demand. On the following Monday, as generation units started to drop off because of the impacts of the weather and some other impacts we'll get into, Bill Magnus, who was then president of ERCOT, he relates that he was looking at the entire system, all of ERCOT, 90% of the state of Texas, losing electricity for months within 7 minutes if he did not start shedding load. And that's because to keep the electric system going, you have to always have balance on there. And so if you get below the generation, what they can put on the system, and the demand that is taking off the system, then you can make the entire system go dark, and then try to reboot that takes months. So he made the call on February the 15th to begin shedding load, because we were faced with the prospect that if one more generator went offline, then the entire system could go dark. That's how close we were, about 7 minutes. At its height, about 50% of all generation, whether it be gas, wind, anything else, was not functioning. So 50% of all of our generation capacity was unavailable at a time when load was sky high. At its highest point, ERCOT shed 20 megawatts of load. That's millions and millions of people and businesses. I mentioned that ERCOT is an energy-only market, and so energy is traded on a wholesale market, and there is a cap by law that says you cannot charge more than $9,000 a megawatt hour. But normally in February in normal winter months, you would be charging $20 a megawatt hour. But starting on February the 15th and running for something like 90 straight hours, we were at the legal cap on the market. So all of the energy that was traded during that time period was sold for a price of $9,000 a megawatt hour instead of $20 a megawatt hour. So you can do the math there and see the huge financial impact this had, both on generators, on people who relied upon that electricity to be able to distribute it to people. And we are still feeling a lot of the financial impacts of that today, and it manifests itself in a lot of different ways. We'll talk about it in a little bit. But it's not just electricity. You mentioned, Claudia, that Texas is blessed with huge oil and gas production capability. And, in the Permian Basin alone, we've just discovered a giant gas field that somehow went unidentified for as long as we've been producing gas out of that area. So, normally we don't even have a lot of storage capacity in Texas, because you can simply produce what is needed by turning on the flow of gas at the wellhead. However, the weather impacted the gas side of the equation equally as much as it did the electricity side. And so you had freeze-offs at all stages of the gas chain. And what I mean by that is you had the wells themselves were impacted by the severe weather. The instrumentation would freeze, and some of them would be unable to work. The gathering lines that normally take all of the gas straight from the wellhead and gather it together to then take it to a pipeline, those had weather-related issues. The compression stations went off. All of their instrumentation froze. And then the pipelines themselves, once it was accumulated and then transmitted through a pipeline, they suffered the same problem. So every stage of the gas supply process was impacted by the weather storm. And as I mentioned, about 50% of the generation capacity in Texas is by natural gas. And so one of the big contributing factors was not only the impact of the weather itself on instrumentation, but it was the inability to get the gas to the gas generation units so that you could produce the electricity that was needed. Normally, we can produce up to 24 BCF, and similar to the electric side of the market, we were at about half of that. So we only had about 50% of the ability to produce gas, and 50% of our generation fleet relies upon that gas. And so that is a big contributor of what happened. And also similar to the electric side, there were huge financial consequences associated with that. So we have been in a pretty stable market because we have so much gas. The wholesale market for gas has been fairly stable at about $3 an MMBTU for a long time. And during this event, the wholesale price of gas rose to around $1,000 an MMBTU. So again, we're talking about huge magnitudes of scale being over what they were and over what people had budgeted for and expected to pay for the gas that they needed, both to heat their homes, heat their businesses, and to supply gas to the generators who were producing electricity, because those generators have to purchase the gas as well. The ones that were functioning have to purchase that gas. So, you know, it was a human tragedy. It was a financial tragedy. It was just, you know, a really difficult and tragic set of events. So let's talk about what the reaction to all of this was. You know, in Texas, we have a legislature that meets every other year. It's not like the U.S. Congress, which is always in session. They only meet every other year for about half a year. But they were actually in session when this happened. They started in January, ran until the end of May, and then suddenly this winter storm happened, and it dominated the politics for a number of months during that session, as you can well imagine. So there's lots of finger pointing going on. The governor, who had appointed all three of the public utility commissioners, was very defensive. The lieutenant governor, who some say may have designs to run for the governor's spot, was pointing the finger at the governor and his appointees. The result of that was that the chairwoman of the PUC, the Public Utility Commission, was forced to resign. In doing so, she wrote a hugely inflammatory letter blaming everybody else in the all the other stakeholders in the marketplace for what happened. Her replacement, the acting chair, he was later forced to resign as well. And then the third commissioner, I guess seeing the writing on the wall, she resigned without being prompted. So during the aftermath of this hugely consequential storm, there was a time when we had 0 public utility commissioners. The acting chair, he stayed on in kind of an interim capacity to try to work through the emergency. But in terms of a functioning administration at the PUC during the aftermath, we really did not have that at the time when we really needed it. And a lot of that is because of the politics. The president of ERCOT, I mentioned him earlier, Bill Magnus, he was fired at the same time. So again, the head of ERCOT and the 3 commissioners of the PUC, they all lost their jobs, and their institutions, of course, were forced to try to deal with this hugely consequential event without the leadership to which they were normally accustomed to. The independent board members of ERCOT, a lot of the press and some politicians pointed some blame towards the independent members because they did not live in the state, and so they weren't feeling the pain of the residents, and so they all resigned en masse. And so again, the 2 primary institutions that were in charge of trying to get the lights back on and trying to deal with the financial after effects of the storm were without any effective leadership at that time. So what happened to the participants in the market? Well, because people had to buy power at $9,000 a megawatt hour, or they had to buy gas at $1,000 a megawatt or an MMBTU, there were lots of bankruptcies. And I want to give one example of Brazos Co-op. I mentioned briefly before that you have the investor-owned utilities, which is the largest portion of the market, and that is all they participate in, and their reps and folks within their service territories can sign up with individual retail electric providers for power. But you also have some government and quasi-governmental folks like municipally owned utilities or co-ops that can choose whether or not to participate in the market. And so some have and some have not. Brazos, it still keeps some of its generation capacity. And so it is a co-op that serves a couple million people south of Dallas, near Waco and that area. And they, it turns out, had not hedged any of their gas costs or their wholesale electric costs that was needed to replace their generation power. And so they were buying it straight from the wholesale market, and they got caught short for the amount of what they owed the generators for the power they had to take to get through the cold snap by 1.9 billion with a B dollars. And so that's how much power they took that they couldn't pay for. And so they declared bankruptcy, and they're also hoping that the legislature would somehow allow them to kind of let the state pay for some of that so that they would not be responsible for it. That did not happen, as we can talk about in a little bit. But they were by far, at the end of the day, the utility with the largest IOU to ERCOT and generators for the power that they consumed but did not pay for. In terms of the retail electric providers, you may have seen the stories about Griddy, Griddy, Griddy. And, I mentioned that retail electric providers can structure a contract however they would like to in terms of trying to attract and keep customers. And some folks did a straight, I'm going to pay 9 cents a kilowatt hour or whatever. And so those people really were not as impacted by what happened, because they were paying a flat rate for what their power was, regardless of whatever the costs were to produce and deliver that power. Now, the reps, who were the middlemen in that scenario, they ended up, they're the ones who have to eat the difference between what they had to pay for the electrons and what they could sell them for. And so they were in a bad place. But Griddy is a little different, because theirs was indexed to the wholesale market. And so they would sell this plan saying, hey, we're the cheapest plan out there. We're just going to go by the wholesale market. And, as I mentioned, usually, especially in the wintertime, wholesale power is really cheap. But when it went from $20 to $9,000, then all of the people that were under those contracts with Griddy, the cost of all of their electricity skyrocketed. And so that is the source of the stories you may have seen where people were getting a $33,000 electric bill for 1 month, gone for $150 to $30,000 in 1 month. And that is because their plan with their retail electric provider was indexed to the wholesale market, and that wholesale market had skyrocketed. And, we continue to have bankruptcies. That's just two larger examples. But one of the things the legislature tried to do in this last session was to create a circumstance where we could stop the flow of bankruptcies and give some financial tools to utilities and reps to allow them to continue operate. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. So that's the utility side. We talked about the political side and the utility and the rep side. But you can imagine, we're a fairly litigious state in in Texas, good for my business. And there were a lot of lawsuits, and there continue to be a lot of lawsuits, to the point where, you know, a lot of plaintiffs' lawyers who normally would have televisions, commercials on saying, have you been injured in an accident? Well, now they're saying, well, did you lose power during the winter storm? So it became quite a thing for these plaintiffs attorneys to try to get as many people as possible to sue everybody. They sued the generators, they sued the pipelines, they sued the wells, they sued the co-ops, they sued ERCOT, they sued the PUC. So there are lawsuits aplenty across the entire stakeholders. And then it's not just the plaintiffs' attorneys in this, but anytime you have the billions and billions of dollars that was trading hands for these transactions at the elevated wholesale market price for both gas and for electricity, you have winners and losers. And so there are lots of lawsuits where people were contracted at a certain amount, and whoever won on that exchange is saying, all right, you got to pay up now. And whoever lost in that exchange is looking for loopholes in the contract to try to figure out a way that they don't have to pay. And so there continue to be an awful lot of commercial lawsuits around those various contracts between market participants. And then I'll also mention that, as I said, suits against ERCOT. You know, ERCOT was kind of caught in the middle. ERCOT doesn't have a lot of enforcement authority itself. It primarily is there to schedule transactions to make sure that the power going on balances the power coming off. And so when they first started shedding load and requiring, dropping people off, whether they be businesses or homes or what have you, that decision came under fire by several people because of some who were on the losing side of that. And then on the decision to stop shedding load, that decision came under fire, and it's the complete opposite. So on the first part of the week, when they first started shedding load, the wholesale market price for electricity was high, but it wasn't all the way at the cap. And so a lot of generators who were still functioning, they went to ERCOT and said, how are we not at the market cap? You know, by definition, if you are forcing people off the system, then we have to be at a situation where the cost of electricity is high as it legally can be. And so ERCOT actually restated its market price for electricity and backdated it to the time when it first started shedding load. Well, that decision and then the decision to change that decision, both of those became big targets for stakeholders that were impacted by those decisions. And then conversely, at the end of the week, they stopped shedding load on Thursday, but the wholesale market price for electricity stayed at the cap of $9,000 a megawatt, and it stayed there for some time, like 20 or 30 hours after they had stopped shedding load. And so the flip side of that decision was, well, if we're not shedding load anymore, why are we still having to pay the $9,000 cap? And so, ERCOT was kind of caught in the middle, coming and going on that. And I'm not quite sure where I cut out, but I think I'll start with the slide that we have up here, which is looking specifically at the root causes. Why did this happen? How could this happen? As you mentioned, Claudia, how is it possible that this could happen? And it's not any one thing, it's a combination of various factors. The first being that it was just too cold for too long. And you know, the people who constructed these facilities didn't anticipate that. They didn't build to a design that would anticipate that level of sustained cold. This isn't Michigan, it's not Wisconsin, it's not Minnesota. So the investors who are building the gas wells, the pipelines, the generating units, typically they're not taking into account the need to maintain operation in circumstances that were as extreme and as severe as we experienced. As the slide says right there, you know, it was 19 degrees Fahrenheit, which is way colder than we normally get. And worse, it was 19 degrees for days and days. And so there was no lit up. And there was lots of precipitation. So, you know, it would get into gauges, it would crack any type of glass, you know, it would work its way into any crevice and crack in the delivery system and expand when it froze and crack things, and that caused an awful lot of operational disruption. So the first leg of the stool is that it was just too cold for too long. Second leg of the stool, excuse me, is that people were not communicating. They weren't talking to each other, and some of that is due to the regulatory structure that we have in the state of Texas. You may or may not know that while the Public Utility Commission of Texas regulates electricity in the state of Texas, it does not regulate natural gas production or natural gas pipelines. That is at the Railroad Commission of Texas. And there are a lot of differences because of that. The three public utility commissioners are appointed by the governor. The three railroad commissioners are elected statewide, and so they have their own constituency. They have their own methods of raising money for those elections, and so that kind of creates different pressures on the regulatory scheme that happens. And one of the examples I want to give to the way that these two schemes were working at cross purposes is both on the electric side and on the gas side, the regulators have outlined the priorities that you follow when there is a disruption, when there is a disruptive event, whether that be a winter storm like we experienced this time, could be a hurricane, could be a tornado, could be very localized, or it could be statewide. But regardless, if you are in a situation where you are having to cut some customers off, there is a list of priorities that you are supposed to follow. And those lists of priorities, both of them are similarly, the highest priority is going to be human needs customers. It's going to be residential customers. It's going to be hospitals, police and fire stations, the things that try to keep society functioning and try to limit the loss of life. That's going to be the highest priority. But where things become a little thornier and a little bit more murky is further down that priority chain. Who's the first off? Who's the second off? And that's where you have, you see the problem with this lack of communication and lack of having working together to try to keep the system afloat. Because on the electric side, one of the first groups of customers that are cut off are the oil patch. So when they started getting constrained, and when you started having rolling blackouts, then you had a lot of oil and gas wells that suddenly did not have electricity, and so their compressors couldn't run. Any of the equipment that they need, both to draw the gas out of the ground, to accumulate it, and then to transmit it, it was hampered not only by the weather, but also by sometimes the lack of electricity to be able to run the infrastructure to keep that gas supply process flowing. On the flip side, you have gas generators, gas generating units that are actually producing the electricity, but they are one of the first off for the gas on a priority system. So when you started having to curtail different customers, one of the first groups that would go off would be the gas generators themselves. And so you had this reinforcing negative feedback loop where you are making things worse for the overall system because of the lack of communication and the lack of thought trying to kind of streamline how this would both electric and gas would work together to keep the overall system afloat. And so that's just an example of the lack of communication and the lack of kind of looking at things as a whole, as opposed to an accumulation of different parts. We don't have a single agency that is going to be spearheading the communications and talking to everyone in natural disasters. Every single agency had their own spokesperson out there that was talking about how they were impacted, their individual group was impacted, but there isn't an emergency response entity that is supposed to be operating as the figurehead in pulling all that information together and making sure everybody is working together, or a resource that you can go to if suddenly you find out that you have no electricity in the oil patch. There was not a go-to place that you could bring those concerns to, or a methodology that you could try to resolve it. And then the third stool is called lack of dispatchable generation. And the flip side out, if you're looking at it, it's also market issues that contributed to the problem that we saw. You know, when I first started this talk, I mentioned the distinction between an energy-only market and a capacity market. A capacity market is something that not only are you trading the electrons themselves, but you can bid to build generating units. And so there is some decision somewhere to say, we need X megawatts of generation in this area that we are serving it, and then we are going to bid out to build that capacity. In an energy-only market, you don't have that. All your trading is the electrons, and so the generators themselves make their own decisions based upon competitive forces and market forces. Is it worthwhile for them to invest in a new generating plant, or is it not in their best interest to invest in a generating plant? And for many years, there has not been much construction at all in the state of Texas for what I'm calling dispatchable generation. And that is something that you can just flip the switch and the turbine starts turning. So that would be a coal unit, a nuclear unit, a gas unit. It could be burning liquid hydrogen, but whatever it is something that you can control when the turbine turns and when it does not. The opposite of that would be wind or solar. You can't control when the wind blows or when the sun shines, and so it's not firm. It's not something that you can always count on. And so we've had an awful lot of construction of wind and solar in Texas, but none of that is dispatchable. We don't have batteries yet that is able to store the power that is generated by those cells, those solar cells. And so it has to be consumed at the time that it is produced. And if the wind's not blowing, the sun's not shining, then you can't count on that to the market. And so one of the problems that we had was, when everything was going down, you just didn't have enough capacity on the system. And a lot of that is due to the market design. Is that additional supply going to do to the market price itself? And so, I think the last leg of our stool is that there is kind of an imperfection in the system that, for many, many years, it helped Texas, the energy-only market helped Texas have some of the lowest cost power in the United States. And so there are great positives to it. And because all of those generating units that you would build for such an event, that's going to be passed through to the consumer in the wholesale price of electricity. And so the lack thereof contributed to very low prices for a long time. But in a situation like we experienced here, the lack of available capacity meant that we were at that $9,000 cap for a very, very long time. And that's not an easy fix. It's very complicated. You're going to have to work through. I mean, is the answer to that? Is it by just demanding that you build more capacity in the market? Is it tweaking some of the market rules themselves to try and create a market incentive for generators to build more capacity? Or, we had some plans that were circulated during the legislature to just build an awful lot of 10 new natural gas generating plants and just have them sitting idle until such time as there was a need for it, until such time as ERCOT had to start shedding load. You would then turn on these things. So the design would be that they are standing outside the market, so that it wouldn't necessarily have an effect upon the wholesale price during normal times. But as soon as you went to a situation where you're going to have to shut people off, then you would turn on these other units. Now, of course, that was the price tag on that was about $8.5 billion as well. But that was another potential solution that was being bandied about, is just building a lot more natural gas plants, but having them operate outside of the market itself. So moving on. So that kind of looks forward to what I was just talking about, kind of looks forward to what the legislature was looking at. As I mentioned, this happened right in the middle of their session. And so there were bills filed everywhere. There was grandstanding going on. There was, everyone had an agenda that they wanted to serve with all of the various legislation that came out of it. And at the end of the day, we came out with two big fixes. I don't know if I like that word because I don't know that it's fixed, but two big bills that have been passed and have been signed by the governor came out of it. And the first one is looking at the financial damage that was done to the market. And that has to do with two bills that were passed to allow market participants to securitize their debt. Securitization, you may know, is essentially a way to bundle all of that debt together and then sell that debt so that you turn, an immediate charge. If I'm Brazos, I owe $1.9 billion and I owe it now. Well, under securitization, now suddenly I can spread that out over 30 years. And so so now it's easier for me to do that. And so that's what the securitization side of it is. It's trying to address the specific financial aspects that kind of came out of it. And then there's Senate Bill 3, which is more geared towards looking at, excuse me, the root causes that we just discussed. And so one of the principal things that they did is they said we need, first they came up with an agency that is going to be that spearheading entity, that entity which is going to be in charge when there is a disaster like this. And that new entity has been charged with the task of identifying all of the critical infrastructure and delivery of electricity in the state. And so that's going to be looking at the gas wells. It's going to be looking at the pipelines, and it's going to be looking at the generators. And this is the group that is necessary to provide it. It's not going to be all the gas wells, because there are an awful lot of very small operators out there that, you know, are not really necessary. And if you put additional financial requirements on them, you would likely they would have to shut them off. But for the big players who are producing the lion's share of the gas, and the pipelines which are transmitting that gas to the gas generators and the gas generators themselves, they're going to identify this critical infrastructure, and then those entities are going to be required to invest in weatherization equipment on all of their critical facilities so that they can withstand that temperature in the future. So that kind of addresses two of the things which I talked about before. One is to have a single entity through which you can communicate to the public, through which the folks can talk amongst themselves. And then the other is to weatherize the facilities that are going to be necessary to produce gas and deliver that gas to the electricity. And then the last thing that it did is the bill kind of punted on the market process and the dispatchable generation problem. It said, okay, we're going to have a committee to study it. Although I can see in this circumstance, because it is so complicated and there are so many kind of interlocking issues which can, whenever you're tweaking the market, you don't want to have unintended consequences. So we will be having a series of the governor will appoint some legislators, and the lieutenant governor will appoint some legislators, and they will be part of a select committee, which will then, in between or before the next regular session, they will be having committee hearings to invite testimony and ideas and everything else, to be looking specifically at these questions of what is the right amount of dispatchable capacity to have in ERCOT. You know, Texas continues to grow. We continue to be one of, if not the fastest growing state in the United States, as we have been for a very long time. You know, Houston, Dallas, and Austin are always at the very top of the list of cities which are growing very, very fast. And so it's not just the problem associated with making sure that we can supply electricity to the load we have, but it's also to make sure that the market can, or is designed in such a way that it can address the growing need, the growing load through businesses and additional residential consumers moving to the state of Texas. You know, that load is significantly growing over time, and so this select committee will be looking at ways to either stimulate the market or possibly even have one of these external market designs out there to prevent disaster. But we don't have an answer to that question. That's something we'll still be looking at.